Welcome to Utopia Science Fiction, the podcast. Today we are joined by our usual design editor, Jonathan, and a special guest star, our assistant editor, Leon Perniciaro. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Today, we are going to be discussing the short story Desertion, written by Clifford D. Simak. So Clifford D. Simak was born in 1904 and passed away in 1988, was an influential and unique U.S. science fiction writer who studied journalism at the University of Wisconsin and worked for newspapers almost all of his life. He won the Hugo 3 times. Typical of his best work, Desertion, written in 1944, was one of the earliest stories to explore pantropy, or human modification, versus environmental modification, which is terraforming, a term that was created by James Blish and used later in his own story cycle. Desertion was incorporated into Simak's mosaic novel City, 1952. Simak wrote in the reissue of the novel, City was written out of disillusion, seeking after a fantasy world that would serve as a counterbalance to the brutality through which the world was passing. City is Simak's best-known book, a true classic, and deserving of much readership. That's all I have to say about Simak. Let's start off with a synopsis about Desertion. So, who wants to start? Leon, do you want to lead off with a synopsis?
This is the first thing I've ever read by Simak, because I guess he died kind of a long time ago, but it's weird because I feel like I grew up reading science fiction from the 50s, 60s, and 70s because it was the only kinds of books you could get used, and I couldn't afford new books. So I don't know how I missed this guy. It's interesting that the story was written in 1944 because it's very much focused on soldiers and these sorts of people. And I guess the premise is that they're trying to colonize Jupiter. He calls it the surface of Jupiter. As the story begins, the main character, who's he's like a general type. He's a supervisor. I don't know exactly what his role is. I can't remember what his title is, but he's about to send the 5th person to be converted to go to the surface of Jupiter, to use his term. I don't know if Jupiter actually has a surface. From what I understand, it doesn't. And he has to report back. The first 4 people haven't come back, but he sends out the person, and the 5th person doesn't come back too. And so he decides he can't send any more people to their death, and so he converts himself and his dog, and they go to the surface of the planet, and they discover a wonderful, magical world on the surface, and they suddenly understand why no one came back, and they also don't go back.
What were your first impressions of Desertion?
Well, it was definitely interesting. A little bit of an echo of Shadow over Innsmouth, particularly with the end, although in a much more positive way, where the main character suddenly finds himself becoming one of the creatures, and it's like, hey, this is much better than being human, and just takes off.
What struck me about this story, if I could jump in, is how deeply religious it is. It is a deeply, deeply religious story, and I thought that was interesting. Did anybody else feel like there was a religious element to the story?
No, not so much. But I'm curious where it struck you as religious.
Basically, it starts from the very, very beginning. They start with introducing Jupiter as this mighty and monstrous planet, this hellish planet in some sense. And the first time I read it, my first thought was that this was like the implacable force of nature, and that's what the story was going to be about. But as I got farther and farther, I started to think that it is a cipher for death and for hell. And the first thing that made me think of this is Miss Stanley, the converter. The story literally says her lips were drawn in a straight, thin line. Her hair seemed skinned back from her forehead tighter than ever, giving her face that queer, almost startling death mask quality. And there's such like a corpse-like look to her, but also the death mask element really like made her stand out for me as either the Grim Reaper or one of his henchmen. What are they called? The psychopomps. The thing that struck me at the end, or once he converts, is that fear of death and the fear of hell is misplaced. because, this is the quote, he had expected a hell of ammonia rain and stinking fumes and the deafening thundering tumult of the storm. He had expected swirling clouds and fog and the snarling flicker of monstrous thunderbolts. But when he gets there, it is actually a beautiful, perfect place where he can distinguish every color and every sound, where he communicates perfectly with his dog as also one of these looper Jupiter creatures.
I remember the first time that I read this through, and all of a sudden, it was this really interesting science fiction thing. And then there was a talking dog, and I was surprised at how okay I was, and how it didn't feel like it was silly at all. It really worked with the piece. And there's just this kind of affection between the dog and there's camaraderie between the dog and Fowler, who's the name of the main character, which I really liked a lot. That was a really poignant moment in the piece.
Basically, the idea is that, beyond death, hell is expected, or with the expectation of this hellish place, but actually he is in this nirvana state, this heaven where there's perfect reasoning, perfect awareness, which I feel like is a very Christian or Western heaven kind of idea.
That's really interesting. I definitely see what you're saying, but I never picked up. So for me, I always saw it as a transcendent story. So there is this transcendence, and there are these themes of death, maybe rebirth, or I think it's not quite rebirth. It's just a change. I never saw the religious connections to it. I did see, things that are common in religion are discussed here, but kind of out of that religious context. But it's interesting that you still picked up that context. So, do you think that Fowler is a sympathetic character? When we start off, we see him sending someone to his death, and Mrs. Stanley, who is the scientist who does the conversions, is very, very cynical of Fowler. And the first thing we get is really her point of view. How can you be so cruel, sending all of these people out to die? The first 4 haven't returned, and you keep sending people out to die. And Fowler, keeps trying to rationalize that. But is he a sympathetic character?
I would say somewhat, because the person he sends after we find out that the first 4 have died is so young, and he's like, please say no. Please don't do this. In his head, but he's not saying it aloud.
Yes, good old Alan, the next on the sacrificial list. Is this a utopian story?
I would say maybe. Definitely not on the human side, but possibly on the Jovian side.
So I guess my feeling is that it is, in a sense, utopian, because, they reach this perfect state, although we don't see their society at all, or the society of the loopers, to know how and where and when and all the salient details for how they live their lives, etc. To know if there are utopian aspects to that. They could go find other loopers and find out that they're all cannibals or something, right? We don't get that. But based on what we do have in the story, I think that the society, or that the creatures they become after they pass through this conversion, is in some sense utopian, but there's a deep-seated irony to it. And I think that it goes back to the idea of why they're on the planet to begin with. Have come to Jupiter. They are going through this process of body conversion with the express purpose of expanding the boundaries of humankind, of pushing humanity to new environments to colonize and to make their presence a dominant presence or a dominant force there. But that human impulse that they have to push the boundary, to expand the human realm, through the process of conversion, they have to lose what it was that made them human. They had to lose that drive, that ambition to push, to see what's beyond.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you read a kind of finality to it, that there's an end, when the story is very much a progressive ending. They're still searching for this understanding, this new understanding. And maybe it's not like what they were looking for before, but I don't think it's ended. I think it's just transformed, it's changed, but there's a continued progression towards these utopian goals, these utopian ideas. It's just they've discovered a different way to realize it.
Yeah,
So
and
I
I don't
feel like,
disagree with that. I guess what I'm saying is that the thing that made them explorers, like that part of being human, that has ended here. You know, they've reached Jupiter. They'll explore Jupiter, but they won't go back to being human, to their imperfect form, and they won't go back to expanding the human race, or whatever the term is I should use, beyond this. You know, at least personally, maybe the people who are still human will do that, but they have reached this point of perfection, and so I don't know. I see what you're saying, sure, but
yeah. Well, I mean, so I guess the logical question is expansion really necessary to being human, or is giving up expansion such a bad idea?
yeah, at least in the context of the story, it is, right? You know, the main thing, this is the quote, the main thing, the only thing is that you come back, that you prove man can live in a Jovian form, so that you prove that we can colonize Jupiter and still be us. That's the opening point of the story, I think. So, yeah, so that quality is, I guess, at the forefront. But it's a good question. I don't know.
Yes, the things they could find, civilization perhaps, civilization that would make the civilization of man seem puny by comparison, beauty, and more important, understanding of that beauty, and a comradeship that no one had ever known before, that no man, no dog, had ever known before. And life, the quickness of life, after what seemed like a drugged existence. I think that's a pretty utopian picture. Or at least a utopian thing to strive for. Well, maybe that is the utopic ending. That is the utopic, that is reaching utopia in a way. And so therefore it is kind of a utopian story.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's definitely a fair point.
Let's talk about Pantropy, since that's really what this story is. What do you think of the pantropic elements of this story? What do you think of Pantropy as a concept?
So this is the idea you introduced in the beginning, I guess, of a person or people changing themselves or being changed so that they can survive in alien or hostile environments, right?
Yes. Yeah, Pantropy was the coined term to describe these kinds of stories. And this is one of the really earliest examples.
I find it kind of interesting. I love stories featuring characters getting transformed into other physical forms, so I've always found that interesting. More in a fantasy setting than science fiction, and I think it's more ecologically ethical, especially if we start finding more complex life either elsewhere in the solar system or in other solar systems. Better to adapt humans to live there than to, destroy that ecosystem to suit human needs.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things I've always wondered about is like the ethical standpoint of Pantropy. And yes, from like approaching from an environmental standpoint, it's good to do this because it doesn't alter the natural order of the planet, the natural environment of the planet that you're visiting. At the same time, is it ethical to change human beings' DNA? We have, genetics going on. That's really controversial as we currently stand.
I think it's also a more natural way of doing it. I mean, it's just we adapted to our current environment, and now we are also in the process of destroying that environment and making it almost impossible to survive here. And both politically and logistically, it's becoming more and more difficult to try to reverse the damage that we've already done. It would probably be easier to change ourselves to meet our altered environment.
If you're doing something voluntarily or if something's being forced on you, it's a question of eugenics, which is obviously evil or clearly evil. designer babies, things like this, that's something else. That's a different topic. But if you could change yourself to have gills or whatever, or to jump like a kangaroo, and you did that voluntarily and you did it for the purpose of going to Mars, I don't know why you would need gills on Mars, then I feel like it's not an ethical question. You have the right to do that to yourself, right?
Here's the other question. Is Pantropy feasible?
I think it is. I mean, we've already created a number of genetically modified organisms, so it wouldn't be too much of a stretch, at least from the technological perspective, to do that to ourselves. I don't know if it could be done to the extent that it is done in the story. We could definitely, at the very least, create a new species.
Yeah.
Probably using surrogate mothers or something like that.
I mean, at what point does it become like playing God when you're trying to mix these genetic material together to kind of evolve humans into a different kind of being? And is it more acceptable if it's done with the interest of adapting us to our environment rather than just making improvements to the human being, or trying to?
I'm not sure, I guess is the answer.
I think doing just enough that you allow them to survive on this new environment. That's when you do like eugenics and designer babies, that kind of thing. The problem with that is, of course, all of the you end up eliminating a lot of potential mutations that could prove beneficial down the line, and you have the problems of inbreeding when you have too small of a gene pool. And when you get into the eugenics, it also becomes impractical, even to do the pantropy.
It's definitely it's a complex question. What do you think about the writing style of Simak in Desertion?
So I guess my thought or my thinking was when reading this is if we had gotten it in the queue, I would have probably given the feedback that up until the point where Alex doesn't come back, I can't remember what page it's on, the first few pages, it felt a little long and maybe it could be condensed a little, but it's...
So I didn't mind the beginning because it established a pace and a character. It established a scene. And from that, you get the transformation. And so that's kind of, you have that build up that, because it's not a straight through, there's a significant shift about halfway through the story. And so it's okay to have that beginning. I didn't think it ran too long because you have that significant shift and you work back on those ideas that you established in the beginning.
I kind of get the sense that he wrote the scene sending the last one out, and then once he figured out what the new creature was going to be, he probably went back and added that little bit at the beginning to sort of foreshadow what was going to happen.
I think his writing is very, very crisp. It's easily readable, and there's a bit of repetition, and the repetition really works for me because it really emphasizes the ideas that he wants you to see and the thoughts that he wants you to consider. Leon touched on this earlier, but what do you think the main theme and the message was for this story?
Dogs are smarter than they look, and humanity sucks.
Honestly, the dog is my favorite character in this in this story. More so every time I read it.
I guess the other thing besides the religious aspects of the story was how the story offers a solution to the Fermi Paradox, and one of my favorite solutions. Basically, the idea of the Fermi Paradox, very briefly, if you don't know what it is that space is really big and space is really old, right? There are billions of stars in the Milky Way, billions of stars in our galaxy.
So the crux of it is basically there's billions of stars in the galaxy, and of those billions of stars, statistically speaking, a certain amount of them would have habitable planets, and of those habitable planets, a certain amount of those inevitably would have life, and of that life, there would be life that could achieve space travel. and would have had time to expand outwards in a way that would have been visible to us? Is that the basics of it?
Yeah, I think that's a very good way to put it, for sure. One of the common answers for the Fermi Paradox is that drive to explore, that a species would naturally have in order to become the dominant species of their planet, and which is like a stepping stone for becoming an interstellar traveler, things like this as a species. One of the solutions for this, one of the filters, it's called, right? So the idea of the great filter basically is that, so all of these things should be true. So somewhere in this process, there's something that stops it. And so the question is often, where is the filter for Earth? Is it behind us? So maybe it's really difficult for life to form on a planet, or is it ahead of us? Maybe interstellar travel is just literally physically impossible. That's the great filter, the thing that filters out civilizations before they make it to be able to make these superstructures in space that be visible from light years away. But that's an aside. So I think this story fits into the Fermi Paradox and offers one of my favorite solutions for the Fermi Paradox, in that it's possible that in order for a species to reach the point where they would be traveling between the stars, they have changed and developed. And so that drive, that ambition that led them to conquer their planet, to conquer their solar system, is somehow lost. And so this is exactly what I think is happening in this story. We start the story with the Earthlings, the humans, whoever, having this drive. We're going to go to Jupiter. We are going to figure out how we can colonize it, and we're going to colonize it. And this is one stepping stone on our path, for expanding humanity to the ends of the universe. But in the process of changing themselves in order to explore and in order to colonize Jupiter, they lose that drive and they lose that ambition. And so that is the filter right there, right?
Yeah.
They will never make a superstructure like a Dyson sphere or something like that would be visible from light years away, because they've reached the point in their evolution or their history as a species where that is no longer a relevant characteristic of the species, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that they're still trying to expand themselves. They're still trying to expand out there, but the perspective, the goal of what they're expanding to shift. But there's still this seeking this better world, this more progressive world. So that drive never goes away. That drive to push outwards, to explore what it means to be human, never changes. They realize that, being human isn't the answer. Maybe they actually consider this. Maybe as being human, they can't find that better answer. Maybe they can't reach this level of perfection that they might be able to when they're in this Jovian form.
That's true. Here's a question, though. Rather, it was a question until I read a little bit further into the story, but I was wondering if the transformation had actually helped make the dog intelligent, but unfortunately, it kind of goes into somewhat silly territory with that.
I think the dog was already intelligent, but this transformation enhanced the intelligence, or at least I think it enhanced the awareness. More than anything else, I think that's what changes when they go through this transformation and become this Jovian life form. The awareness of the world around them, of the universe around them, shifts. It somehow becomes something more. And so the dog has always been intelligent. But suddenly, Fowler is aware of the dog's intelligence, and the dog is aware of the human's intelligence.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any closing remarks or any questions that they would like to ask about this story? The one thing that I wanted to, that I remembered what I wanted to say. So I think about regarding Simak's writing style, I think it's very easy to see the newspaper writer and the newspaper editor in his story. I think it reads kind of like you would read a newspaper article, like the sentence structure.
Yeah. I can definitely see that.
All right. So I think that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you, Leon, for joining us, and we hope we'll have you back sometime soon. Take care, everyone.
Take care.